I should say that when I came in this morning, they asked me, do you have a PowerPoint for your presentation? And I said, because I'm talking about sex, I thought it might be better not to do illustrations. I'm not a prude, but it just seemed, This morning, I got my wife and my youngest off to back home. My wife is a teacher, as I mentioned, and she has stuff that she has to do. My oldest is staying with me through the end of the week, which I'm very, very thankful for, because every day that I'm away from my family is a day that is a loss. So I try to work things out in one way or another so we can spend as much time together as possible. But my youngest said this morning as we were getting in the car, she said this, and she has sort of an unusual turn of phrase for a small kid. Sometimes I sort of look at her and think, is there like a 45-year-old hiding in this body of an 8-year-old? She said something to the effect of, I'll try to quote it exactly, it seems a pity that we're leaving today. I was just getting used to Adelaide and starting to like it. And well, I know this isn't Adelaide per se, but I didn't get into the differences between being part of a city and a state, But I thought it was a lovely little statement. Just starting to get used to it and liking it. So there must be something that you have here that is very likable, even to an 8-year-old. A particularly perceptive one, I might add. Well, I had an interesting experience, and maybe you did too. There was a photograph that was on the internet that caused a sensation recently. And I had a hard time understanding what the fuss was all about. You see, the photograph was a photograph of a dress. Well, friends, I've seen a lot of dresses over time. It takes a lot to get me particularly excited. But I was driving to work, I was listening to the radio, and these guys were talking about this amazing picture of a dress. It was very hard to imagine, to be honest, because they said this dress, if you looked at it, some people saw a dress that was blue with black stripes. Did you hear about this? But then other people saw the dress, and they saw a white dress with gold stripes. And I was driving along thinking, what? That can't be right. I mean, I know what blue looks like, and I know what white looks like, and, I know the difference. So I got to work, and of course this story was trending, so I clicked on it, and there was a picture of what was obviously a dark blue dress with black stripes. Did you guys see this? You know what I'm talking about? You guys saw it. And I thought, what kind of nonsense are they talking about? It's a dark blue dress with black stripes. Anyway, later on in the day, another picture came up because, it was on another site, and I looked at it, and I was gobsmacked because there I saw a white dress with brown stripes. How could the same dress be dark blue and black and white and gold? I couldn't figure it out. Well, it turns out, because I heard an explanation about this, that the way our minds view the world is determined by the context in which it's viewed. And when this dress is in one context, you see one thing. When it's in a slightly different context, you see something quite different. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't actually a color to this dress, but just that the context through which you view it determines what color you see. This morning, I'm going to be presenting a first of a two-part series on the sexual revolution. This is the sexual revolution Part 1. And what I'd like to suggest to you is this: that the context through which and around which we're viewing sex will determine the way we perceive it. Does that make sense? The context around with it. And in some ways, the ability for our minds to see the same thing in starkly different ways based on context explains how societies can change the way that they view a particular thing or entity very, very rapidly. In the case of Western civilizations, in our lifetime, perceptions of sexuality have changed very, very radically, very, very quickly. I should just note, I just give an aside, I see a lot of children coming in. I mentioned this at the beginning. This talk is about sexuality. That means that there will be things that I personally wouldn't have my children listening to, but you can make that decision. And tomorrow's talk will similarly be about sexuality. So you make that decision. There are children's programs on. So let me just keep on going. So no area has changed as rapidly or fundamentally as Western perceptions of sexuality. Today, Western society is at the end of a seismic shift on the way it perceives human sexuality. The shift began with the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution produced new sexual norms. Those norms have become sexual orthodoxies. And those orthodoxies are rapidly becoming new legal frameworks. And the context with which we view this change will determine what we make of it. In the context of popular opinion and the mainstream media, the shift is a wonderful thing. It has thrown off years of sexual oppression and resulted in sexual violence, gender oppression, discrimination, and psychological abuse. We are now free of the chains that inhibited the full range of human sexuality. But of course, in our context of the Bible, the shift looks very, very different. It looks deeply damaging. It strikes at the heart of the family, robs children of their natural rights, and is physically, spiritually, and psychologically catastrophic on those who choose to live out the new sexual orthodoxy. The underlying behavior is the same, but the context in which you view it determines what you see. Does that make sense? Today, even regular churchgoers, even you and me, are getting far more of our information about sexual norms and behaviors from the mass media than we are from church. We're getting much more time spent in the mass media than we are in Scripture. Increasingly, our mass media is determining our context, and that context determines how we perceive reality. Are you with me? My challenge to you this morning as we begin to look at some very difficult issues and some complex issues is this: what is the context to which you view human sexuality? If your context is popular culture, you are going to disagree with every single thing I say. If your context and frame of reference is the Scripture, I think we'll find that we're broadly in agreement. So ask yourself that question. What context, what frame of reference, what viewpoint do you look at this complex issue through? You know, even as sexual norms have changed and our society is talking about this issue incessantly, the church has become increasingly silent. Maybe it's because we feel a little bit prudish. We're uncomfortable talking about this issue. But I got news for you, friends. Don't be too prudish. If it wasn't for sex, none of us would be here. Okay? We can talk about this. That's where we all came from, so. But increasingly, the silence among Christians is turning into confusion. And confusion is turning into an inability to respond. And that inability to respond has removed a huge barrier to the final completion of the sexual revolution. For many Christians, we would rather be liked than to be a voice crying in the wilderness. We were never particularly comfortable talking about sex in the first place. We don't really want to start now. When? Well, it's going to make us rather unpopular. We would rather talk about the sins of the past, the sins of the future, than to talk about the sins of now. In fact, we'd prefer not to talk about sin at all, because after all, that's uncomfortable. 2 Timothy 4:2 may say, preach the word, be prepared in season and out of season, correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction. But to be honest with you, it's a lot more comfortable just simply to go with society's flow. Isn't it? Of course it is. Of course, we don't live in the future, we don't live in the past, we live now. And as uncomfortable and as dangerous as it is, Christians, I believe, have a moral obligation to speak up about the sins of today. We are seeing the greatest crime against our future generations being perpetrated in our midst. We need to be the ones who call out that the emperor has no clothes. And if we are hated for doing so, so be it. Jesus was hated too. It didn't stop him. You know, we have that statement, all those who are in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution, and yet most of us have never suffered any persecution, which makes you wonder how close we are to God versus how close we are to the world. You know, we had our 100th year anniversary for the Barossa Valley Church this last Sabbath. It was a fabulous thing. I already said that if you could have been there, you would have loved it. One of the things that struck out to me was the early Seventh-day Adventists right here in the Barossa suffered tremendous antagonism from the general community. They were not appreciated. They had eggs thrown at them. They were lambasted. They were shunned. They had everything go on. And yet, that didn't stop them from saying, you know what? We've seen something that we want. We're going to follow that. We're not going to be cowed by social norms or disapproval. If we find ourselves in general agreement with the world, we have to ask ourselves the hard question: how can that be? If our views are following the world's views, is it because we are following the world rather than following Christ? Today, there isn't anything much more countercultural than Christianity. And the heart of our countercultural perspective is our view of sex. The Bible presents a view of sex that runs directly against most cultures throughout most history. Let's just start at the beginning when God created Adam and Eve. There's something rather unusual about this arrangement. You see, Adam was created with just Adam and just one woman. Some people would argue this is a very imperfect beginning, because before you settle down with a single partner, you should experiment around to see who you're sexually compatible with. We'll look at that in a few minutes. Throughout most history, powerful men have had more than one partner. In fact, polygamy, particularly among the rich and the powerful, is the norm around our world. I grew up in Malaysia. They had polygamy, for example. And of course, they're hardly alone. If God would have created a few women, Adam could have had a few lovers so he could get some sexual experience before settling down. God could have created every conceivable sexual practice so that Adam could be catered for. But our all-powerful, all-loving God, the God who created us in his image, put one man and one woman together as partners. Did God make a mistake? What an empowering arrangement for men, for women, and for children. Don't believe me? Think about the alternative. Think about what multiple partners in a marriage does for those involved. Don't think theoretically, think practically. If you're a married man, think about what it would mean if your wife had a second guy in the marriage. How would you feel about life? Would you be happy and satisfied? Have any of you, when you were dating, did you ever have a girlfriend who tried to two-time you? Did it feel good? How would you like that for the rest of your life? If you're a woman, imagine how disempowering and vulnerable you are if your husband takes on multiple wives or a mistress. Would you be happy? Is that something that's compatible with human nature? Is that something that you'd be happy about? To ask the question is to answer it, isn't it? I can see you're not giving me any visual clues up there, but I'm quite confident that you would not be happy. Why? Because you're a human being. It's emotionally devastating. Financially, it's also very complex. And when it comes to children, it is an abject catastrophe. It is a formula for maximum conflict on multiple levels. The Bible contains a number of cautionary stories on the impact of multiple marriages with multiple spouses. Jacob's marriage to two sisters resulted in happiness. Did they all live happily ever after? Resulted in Joseph being thrown into a pit and sold into slavery. That was the result of that multiple marriage. What about Abraham's dalliance with the second woman? Has that resulted in happiness? Every time you open up your newspapers and you read about the conflict in the Middle East, what you're reading about is the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac still hating each other. That's what you're seeing. That was the result of that little experiment in multiple partners. The multiple marriages, despite that, are the norm in much of the world during much of history. There's an interesting Indian philosopher. His name is Vishwal, and I'll try to say this right, Mangalwadi. Vishwal Mangalwadi. And he observes that among the principal reasons that Western culture has dominated the world is because it avoided the enormous dysfunction that engulfs so many families through multiple marriages, and collectively so many cultures. You see, your families are weak, and they're fighting, and there's all the dysfunction that goes on with this multiple partners. Well, a society is only as strong as the collection of those families, and a nation is only as strong as the collection of its communities. This is what he has to say. The West alone was able to harbor sexual energy to build strong families, which results in strong women, strong children, and strong economies, and strong nations. The idea that one man should be married to one woman for a lifelong exclusive relationship without other girlfriends and mistresses, how much destruction is caused by multiple marriages. The idea of monogamy is not a Muslim idea. It is not a Buddhist idea. It's not a Hindu idea. It is not a secular idea. Marx didn't believe in it. Plato didn't believe in it. Freud didn't believe in it. And Hugh Hefner, he certainly didn't believe in it. So this is a peculiar Christian idea. Monogamy is an idea that spread globally through the church. You know, we often make fun of the Victorians for their prudish perspectives on sexual behavior. But before we laugh too much, just imagine those Victorians from Great Britain were able to control vast swathes of the world. And one of the reasons they were able to do that and have the advances in engineering, science, philosophy, medicine was because they had an organized, productive society. And one of the primary reasons they were able to have that organized, productive society was because, yes, they did channel sexual energy into stable families that then invested in the children that were produced by those families. There's an interesting thing that I read not too long ago, and it was about Osama bin Laden. Remember Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind 9/11? And of course, what a lot of people have been asking, or asked subsequently, is what was it that prompted Osama bin Laden to go down that road? It's a good question, isn't it? And of course, there's political reasons, and there's religious reasons, but that doesn't explain entirely what he did, because on 9/11, Osama bin Laden knew he wasn't just killing Christians, he wasn't just killing Americans, he wasn't just striking at one nation. He knew that in those towers there were people who were Muslim. He knew that there were Hindus and Buddhists and people from every conceivable country on earth working there. He knew that in the planes that would be flown into the World Trade Center, that there were people who were probably, very likely, people who shared precisely his worldview and even his religious views. But he ignored that and still went ahead with that plan. It is like a very hard thing for us to understand. Imagine you dislike your enemies, but would you kill people who are your co-religionists in order to get to them? Something is very strange there. And so some psychologists have done some work on this, and some other theorists, and there's an interesting theory that's developed. They point out that rage is generally not the result of impersonal actions from far away. That normally isn't the thing that makes us most angry. Rage actually comes out of pain. And who is it that hurts us the most, or has the capacity to hurt us the most? Is it the President of the United States? Or even the Ayatollah in Iran or whatever? He can do what he wants. I might not like what he has to say, but to be honest with you, it doesn't normally change my life that much. Who is it that can hurt us the most in life? It's the people we love the most, isn't it? Of course. And who we are most dependent on in the most intimate manner. And in the case of a child, there is nobody who can hurt us in the way that our parents can hurt us. Are you with me? Hopefully none of you know what I'm talking about, because you all had wonderful parents who did their best and all those things. But imagine if you did not. Now, it turns out that Osama bin Laden grew up in a very, very complex situation. His mother was his father's 10th wife. How would you feel? How much love and affection are you going to get from Papa? How much dad time are you going to get? He was one of 52 children. And when he was young, his father divorced his mother. His mother subsequently remarried, had 4 children with her new husband, and Osama bin Laden was the odd one out, the half-brother. Now, these theorists believe that Osama bin Laden probably grew up feeling very, very, very much like an unnoticed fifth wheel. He probably was hurt very, very profoundly. He probably was asking himself, where do I fit in and why do I matter? And some have theorized that tremendous feeling of disempowerment and that tremendous pain from feeling unloved resulted in tremendous rage, not just against America or various different third parties, but against the world in general and life. And it was that rage that prompted Osama bin Laden, a man who was wealthy, and had opportunities to do all sorts of things, to instead dedicate his life to the mass killing of others. Of course, that's an extreme result of multiple marriages. On a much smaller scale, pain, dysfunction, disharmony, and personal destruction are the natural results of polygamy. But it's all avoided if we follow God's plan. There's a way that seems right to man, but the end leads in destruction. Follow God's plan, it's all avoided. Of course, today we don't permit polygamy in Australia. Or do we? In truth, men and women can have as many spouses as they choose. They just can't have them legally all at the same time. And they can have as many lovers as they like, even when they are married. Even in our church, divorce has become so common as not to be commented upon. I know it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about because it has affected so many of our lives. We feel that saying anything touches just a little bit too close to home. But I would like to suggest to you this morning that that's exactly why we need to talk about it. As many of you know, my own parents were divorced. I know what it's like to live through the pain of a divorce. Fortunately, I was older when that happened, but nonetheless, it was a devastating event in my life. For those of you who have been divorced or have had parents or children divorced, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But just because we lived through it, and I lived through it, doesn't mean we can't talk about it. Does it? Can we talk about it? Okay. Well, if you don't want to hear about it, now's a great time to leave, because I'm just about to. The Bible teaches that divorce is against God's will. Some people look at Christ and believe that when he came, he loosened all the norms, particularly the sexual norms. They say, you know, Christ is all about love and acceptance, and that means you can do pretty much anything you want. But you know, love is not an abstract idea that has no context or contours. Christ didn't just say love one another. He explained how we were to love one another. When it came to divorce, what he had to say, friends, was not permissive in any way, shape, or form. In Matthew 19, you find it, starting in verse 4, he said, "Haven't you read," Jesus replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And he said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man could give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not that way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery." It's a pretty heavy thing. We don't talk about it much in our church because we're afraid that if we talk about things like this, people will be offended, they won't come back. Well, friends, I believe that we need to talk about these sorts of things a lot more. Why? Because this is a challenge to us today. And God, through Christ, in Christ's life, sent down a message to us, and we should not ignore it. We have largely, as a society, rejected Jesus' command, and we're paying the price. Everything from children's academic success to familial fiscal stability, emotional health, through to crime, all are negatively impacted by divorce. WebMD summarizes the data as follows, quote, "Children of divorced parents have nearly triple the emotional problems, drug use, and arrests, and are more likely to drop out of school and to have unwanted pregnancies." You know, we have a lot of discussion in Australia today about the problem with crystal meth in our society, and particularly among our young people. And there's a lot of ideas of what to do to address this epidemic. And it just absolutely takes people's lives and shreds them. And alcohol abuse similarly. What I'd suggest to you today is that the place to start in preventing drug abuse is not through rehab or advertising campaigns or through jail or busting drug dealers or any of that kind of bikie gangs. The place to start is to ask, why are kids feeling such a tremendous need for something to fill their souls? That's not the only reason, but this is one of the reasons. Interesting, Louis Terman at Stanford University has done a long-term study on the effects of divorce on children. And one of the things about this study that I think is particularly interesting is this. Children whose parents divorced when they were young, on average, in his study, die 5 years earlier than children whose parents did not. Now, obviously, there's some things that go into that, but what's interesting about it is that he found that children whose parents actually, died young, and so they left them that way rather than through divorce, actually lived to the same length of time as children whose parents lived out a full life together married. In other words, divorce appears to be more damaging to children in the long run than a parent's death. Now, when I read that, I thought about my own life. Many of you know that my father was killed in a car accident 7 years ago, and it's a very painful thing for me even to talk about, to be honest. It's difficult. But you know something? As painful as that is to me, my parents' divorce is a much more painful thing. Much more painful thing. Why? Because when your parents divorce, they rip apart the security that you have within your family, and all of a sudden the two people that you love the most don't love each other anymore. And that's a very, very painful thing. Interesting, Gene Gumbiner, who is a PhD, licensed psychologist, clinical professor at the University of California, Irvine College of Medicine, so a pretty successful person in the area of psychology, and she specializes in adolescence and child development. And she recently wrote something that I think is very, very touching, where she talked about the impact of divorce on children. This is what she had to say. Now, this is kind of a long quote, but I'm going to read it all because you know what? I reckon every word counts. During the 70s, when psychological literature first discussed the effects of divorce on children, the general view was that divorce doesn't have to harm children. But it does. Children, even intelligent ones or older ones, often think it's their fault. There is a lot of self-blame. Grade sufferer. I lost my motivation in school. My grades went down. Not studying was a form of rebellion, anger, and apathy. I really didn't care what became of me. Perhaps the kid is stuck with a depressed mother who can't leave the room, clean up the kitchen, or take the child to school. This child is ashamed to invite friends to the home, and the school and the friendships suffer. My brother couldn't play Little League, which is baseball, because there was no one to drive him out to the games. Papa was gone. Extracurricular activities suffered. Then there's the loss of control of the loved parent. Without a father around, I was very promiscuous. I sought affection from adolescent boys. I was unsupervised, and I got into trouble. There was no one to set limits, no one to ask where I was going. And then going to school and being the kid from a single-parent home felt shameful. Everyone else, at least it seemed, had two parents watching them at the holiday play or a family to go camping with, not to mention the financial loss, a lost home, a lost neighborhood, lost friends. For me, I lost my entire extended family, beloved grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Divorce hurts children, and it hurts them immediately in the short term. Psychological theory in the 70s was heavily influenced by Maslow and the self-actualization theory. Those of you who have studied psychology at university will know about Maslow. People believed that it was okay to get divorced for self-growth. It was okay for parents to leave their families to pursue their dream of happiness. This is selfish, plain and simple. Who puts children at risk for their own dream of happiness? How many fathers left their own children only to adopt the burdens of someone else's? Children are vulnerable. They are minors. They are dependent on an adult. Adults are supposed to be the responsible ones. Divorce even has long-term consequences for grown children. It affects their relationships. I went into marriage knowing I could leave. Statistical studies indicate that children of divorce are more likely to divorce themselves. I was also cautious about trusting others because I knew that they could leave me. Parental divorce affects children's future relationships. My parents' divorce still affects me today, many decades later. It affected me as a child. It affected my marriage. It affects me today. Divorce has children, even grown ones. My parents' divorce has a lifelong effect on me, and I am still feeling them. Whew. It's a powerful testimony, but not in the way that you'd hope for. And of course, it's not just kids that divorce hurts. A recent study in the UK found that 54%, over half the people who had divorced, later on had regrets about that divorce. What's interesting is when the Australian divorce laws changed under Gough Whitlam and loosened, there was an immediate spike in the number of divorces in Australia, and subsequently the number of divorces as a ratio of the number of marriages settled down at about twice what it was before divorce laws were changed. I wonder, looking at that 54% perspective of marriages who regret their divorce later on, I wonder how many of those divorces, that the incremental increase in divorces were in many ways unnecessary. Another study found that divorced men are more likely to suffer depression, substance abuse, and die prematurely. Women also suffer. According to a University of Iowa study, for example, divorce increases chronic stress and produces greater physical illness among women. The Bible, well, it teaches against divorce, except in the most extreme cases. We haven't listened. As a society, we are paying an immense price for ignoring God's word and inflicting great emotional destruction on our children. And in the face of all this, many in our church remain silent, and Christians are cowed. I believe it's time for us to find our voice. It's time to remember our backbone. And maybe it's time to muster the courage to speak about these issues. So we've looked at polygamy, we've talked about divorce. Let's go on to sex outside of marriage, sex before marriage. Once again, the Bible's teaching against sex before marriage is entirely unpopular. Some go as far as to argue that you can't enjoy sex unless you've experienced with a number of people first. And it is common to hear the idea that couples should fool around before getting married to make sure their sexual chemistry is right. There seems to be an article on this about once a week in the Sydney Morning Herald. The Fairfax Press is very keen on this idea. And very confident that this is the way you should go. So what do you reckon, guys? Are they right? Should you have multiple sex partners before you get married just to make sure, you get a bit of variety and check it out? Well, apparently not. A University of Chicago study found, dun, 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 that married people not only have the most sex, but they have the most enjoyable sex. And what's interesting about this study is it also found that religious couples enjoy sex more, on average, than non-religious. I thought you guys would all clap at that point. There you go. And this might seem like a counterintuitive thing. We've seen so many movies and TV shows, and we've heard so many books and things where it's all the tension comes up, and then bam, it all happens, and there's something sort of fabulous in the air with sort of a short-term lover, the sort of strangers in the night scenario. But when we think about it, the research that says that sex among married people is actually better and more enjoyable makes a lot of sense. It's like any other team sport. Who goes out and forms any kind of team activity and does the best they're ever going to do the first time they work together. And also, during sex, we're both physically and emotionally vulnerable. Who wants to have that vulnerability with somebody who hasn't made any kind of commitment to love and cherish them? How satisfying is it going to be? There's an interesting article about life for single people in the Sydney Morning Herald magazine a few weeks ago, and my wife read it and said, this is something of a different take. It was this guy saying, you're going to have your friends tell you all kinds of things about how great sex is, and their great sexual escapades and how they're doing all sorts of wonderful and wily things. Just remember that all your friends are doing is lying. Especially guys. Guys start lying about this stuff very early. We're constantly bombarded with the idea that sex outside of marriage is somehow more passionate or satisfying. Friends, it is a lie. Simple. It's a lie. But we also pay a huge price for our promiscuous culture. One of the prices that we pay is, of course, through the sexually transmitted infections. The number of Australians with sexually transmitted infections is growing. It's estimated, for example, that up to 500,000 Australians have chlamydia and don't even know about it. Now, chlamydia is a disease that can render you unable to have children, so it's not a joke. And, of course, there's gonorrhea, genital warts, HIV/AIDS, syphilis, and all the other things. And it's not just that the age of infections, not the number of infections is increasing, but also the age of contracting these diseases is decreasing. Epidemiologist Carol L. Hayek from the Burnett Institute says that the high rate of chlamydia in children and young teens bears out evidence that the age of first sexual activity in Australia has been decreasing. This is not a formula for happiness. This is a formula for great pain. But there's another outcome of sex outside of marriage, and that is unwanted births or unwanted pregnancy. And that can be handled in one of two ways. The baby can be taken to term, or the child can be legally aborted. In the United States today, there are about 1 million babies aborted every year. And according to statistics that I looked at not too long ago, over 95% of those babies are healthy babies with healthy mothers who were conceived consensually. Now, I know that it's uncomfortable talking about the morality of all of this, but I will just say this. If God knew David while he was in his mother's womb, and if John the Baptist could be filled with the Holy Spirit while he was still in the womb, if God could know each one of us before we were born, then I have to imagine that God knows each one of those little ones. Are you with me? And Jesus himself said that anyone who offends a child, well, you know the rest of that quote, don't you? As some of you know, our first child was born very prematurely. She was born 10 weeks premature. She was very tiny, fragile, completely and utterly dependent on us. When I first saw her I was in the delivery room, so I saw her first there, but when I saw her in the nursery, I put my finger through the incubator into her little hand, and the little hand went. And the nurses said, well, that's just a human reflex. That's what babies do. So I have this picture with this little tiny hand wrapped around my finger. She may have been very small, but does that mean that she wasn't a person? Does it mean that her life had no value? How would society feel if we walked into that, if somebody walked into a neonatal intensive care unit and started killing all the little babies? Wouldn't you be horrified? And yet, in many countries today, children can be aborted at will. Some say, well, some of them are aborted younger than your child. Well, that's true. But does it mean their lives have no value whatsoever? It's interesting, we talk a lot about human rights in our society. But don't human rights start with life? After all, you have no rights at all if you were killed before you're born. I quake when I think about Western societies have decided that babies can, for whatever reason, be killed. There's a myth that abortion is a simple procedure that solves the problem, but that is just another lie. How many of you know Nicki Minaj? I can see you got a lot of hip-hop fans here this morning. Nicki Minaj is a very popular hip-hop artist, okay? She is if you ever seen her videos, they're quite raunchy. I'm not recommending her stuff. She's very tough, raunchy, urban sort of rapper. And last year, though, she discussed for the first time the abortion that she had roughly 16 years ago. In fact, one of her songs, she raps about a child who would be 16 now if the child had lived. Now, if there's anybody on earth who you think would not be excessively concerned about an abortion, it'd be this hip-hop star with swagger, tough, foul mouth. But interestingly, she had this to say, because behind all the makeup and the swagger and the big success and the bravado, behind all of that is just a person. He's just a person, a human being. And this is what she said about aborting her child. Quote, "It has haunted me all my life." And the grandfather of heavy metal rock, Ozzy Osbourne's grandfather of heavy metal rock, Ozzy Osbourne. I don't know, do you guys remember that group Black Sabbath? You heard about them. They just because it got a lot of attention in Adventism, there used to be a rumor going around that Black Sabbath went to Andrews University. Friends, they did not go to Andrews University. Okay, they're from Birmingham. They probably never heard of Andrews University, but anyway. But they had sort of a lot of occultic images in their sort of songs and so forth. Ozzy Osbourne was their lead singer. Quite a flamboyant character. He later sang a song that people were saying that he worshipped the devil, and he didn't worship the devil, but he'd done everything he could to confuse people, I'll say that. Well, his wife Sharon, who is, both Ozzy and Sharon are reality TV stars in the U.S. I don't know if their shows here, but they're quite well known. But she recently, you think of, once again, someone who wouldn't care less about any of this stuff. She recently expressed similar regrets. She said, "I would never recommend abortion to anyone, as it comes back to haunt you." Now, I'll just tell you a family story, if you don't mind. I told you that my family's from this area. And I discussed this whole issue with a friend of mine not too long ago. And he challenged me. He said, James, you're all for the rights of children and all this stuff, and you think that abortion's wrong. And I said, yeah, that's right. And he said, well, what if one of your children got pregnant? Hey, wouldn't you just want the simple, clean, get it over and done with option? My response to him is the same response that hopefully that won't happen, but if it does, it's the response I'll give my children, and that is, I will love them just as much as I ever did, and I will do everything I can to support any child they have in any circumstance. But please don't take the life of another human being. Do not take the life of your child. It turns out that this is something that has particular resonance to me right now because, as I mentioned, my family is from this area. And my, great-great-great-grandfather moved here. And then he had a son, and that son had a daughter. And that daughter, and I don't know how or why or what the circumstances were, but she fell pregnant outside of marriage. And I want to tell you, I sure am glad she did not abort that baby. Because that baby was my grandfather. And my grandfather had my dad, and my dad, of course, had me. We've been told that sex outside of marriage is a great thing. It's a wonderful thing. It'll fulfill you sexually. No, it won't. It'll bring you happiness. No, it won't. It'll fulfill you and make society better. No, it won't. Instead, it has created enormous pain and enormous suffering. I just want to say something at this point, because I'm talking about a lot of issues that many of us, if we looked into our own hearts, would say, oh, wait a second. Some of these things that we're talking about, I've done myself. I've had a girlfriend who had an abortion, or I had sex with people outside of marriage, or I've had an affair, or I've been divorced. I know that. I know that I'm not talking to a group of people who've never experienced sin in their lives. And I want you to know for sure, in case you're looking at me and saying, look at that hypocrite up there, he's acting like he's never done anything wrong. I have done things wrong. And I've done things wrong in this area. Like I bet nearly all of you have too. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm just going to say that. But the point of Christianity isn't to say we're all perfect, that we've never sinned and come short of the glory of God. The point of Christianity is to say sin, whether we're Christians or non-Christians, hurts. Let's address it and let's ask God to forgive us for what we've done wrong, which He will, gracefully and fully, and give us the power so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Are you with me? I don't want you to harm yourselves or other people by making these mistakes that the world is saying is good. It's not good. It's bad and it hurts. I don't want it in my life. I don't want it for your life. Let's look at the final issue that we're going to touch on today. Don't worry, there's a part 2. It's coming. That's tomorrow. There's a final area I'll touch today, and that's where the Bible's teachers run, where Bible teachings on sexuality run in complete tensions to society, and it is pornography. Now, I won't ask you to raise your hands if you've ever seen a pornographic image, but I am going to assume that I don't need to describe what pornography is to you. Why? Because it's everywhere. It used to be that if you wanted to see graphic pornography or hardcore pornography, or whatever you want to call it, you'd have to go to a sort of a particular place in town, a seedy sort of area, and there you'd see it. But today, everybody who has internet access has a front row seat in the most graphic, pornographic images available. In other words, for most of us, we now have pornography piped directly into our homes. It doesn't mean that we're looking at it, but it does mean that for many of us, or maybe for most of us, it's now available at a click. And for many, this is a cause for celebration. One writer put it this way: hooray for porn! What would we be without it? We'd be bored, repressed, and frustrated. Porn nails the lie that sex is something we should be ashamed of. Hooray! That's an interesting perspective, and quite at odds with what Jesus said. Jesus' view was quite different. He said in Matthew 5:28, and this is one of the hard sayings of Jesus, particularly for men, I think, but here it is: anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So on one side, you're being told, hooray for porn, it's released us, it's given us a sort of got rid of our repression. On the other side, you've got Jesus saying, if you're looking at a woman with lust in your heart, that's equivalent to committing adultery. That's wrong. And the Bible is very explicit that adultery is a sin that keeps us out of the kingdom. Of course, it can be forgiven like every other sin, but we have to, of course, request that forgiveness. So was Jesus right? Is pornography something that's bad and destructive? Or is the writer who said hooray for pornography right? Who's correct on this? Well, interesting, researchers from the Max Planck Institute in Berlin found that a part of the brain which activates when people feel motivated and rewarded shrinks and works less efficiently in those who frequently watch pornography. It actually changes your brain. There's a whole bunch of articles on this. You should look at them because they're very important. So people who watch a lot of porn are likely to need increasingly graphic material to achieve the same sexual stimulation. Do you understand what this is saying? The actual pleasure center of your brain shrinks if you're watching a lot of pornography, and because that shrinks, you need more of it and more graphic images to get the same sexual interest. Does that sound like something you want to have happen to your brain? To be able to enjoy sex less? That's exactly what happens to you. The need for more graphic images leads in very dark and disturbing areas. This isn't some happy hanky-panky with something that harms the way, it's something that harms the way we think and dulls our ability to enjoy sex with a real person. But that's only part of the story, because it also impacts what people expect in sex. Instead of a loving interaction between two equals, pornography typically degrades women and presents them as acting in ways that no healthy woman does. Porn makes women into objects and takes away their humanity and degrades them. You know, I have to tell you, I am afraid, and I'm going to tell you, they say never be afraid, but I am afraid. And this is what I'm afraid about. According to the New York Times, kids as young as 6 and 7 are now exposed to hardcore pornography on the internet. And I wonder of the boys who are going to date my daughters, what they will have seen and what they think women are like. I'm afraid for what that expectation is and how completely out of kilter with reality it is. You know, one way to explain pornography is kind of like James Bond films. People go to see James Bond films not because that's what life is like, it's because that's what life isn't like. Right? Most of us are not driving around in Aston Martins pursuing Soviet agents and so forth. I'll speak for myself, but I'm going to assume that most of you in exotic locations. People go to see those films because it's a fantasy. It's a world that A, doesn't exist, and B, it's a world that they don't live in. Well, the same thing goes for pornography. Pornography is films about things that don't happen in the way that they're portrayed. It's a fantasy. And the problem is that it is very confusing, particularly for young guys as they're growing up. And I fear for the ability of young men who have been bathed in this culture to experience and enjoy real intimacy with a real woman when they will come to marriage. Jesus said, don't even look at a woman with lust. And I'll be the first to say that's a hard standard. But the mess our society is in today, because of the explosion of pornography, indicates that God knows much better than we do. God designed us, God designed sex, and He knew exactly what He was doing. He gives us an instruction book, and the book says sex is good. It is good in a marriage between one man and one woman, a marriage between one man and one woman destined to last a lifetime. The sexual revolution has taught exactly the opposite. It teaches that sex should not be reserved for marriage, that sex is good with multiple partners, that sex should be had before marriage, that marriages can be broken apart at will and everything's going to be okay. Even better, that happiness will be enhanced. It said that all of our problems that come from sex outside of marriage can easily be solved. All of that, all of it, friends, is a lie. It's a lie that's come from the father of lies. And it's a lie that is eating the heart out of our Western civilization. Tomorrow, we'll start by looking at how weak our Western civilization is today, and how the next step in the sexual revolution is harming our society, our children, and our future, and how it is going to impact our church. I'm going to judge by how many people show up tomorrow, whether you've got any interest in that or not. Maybe you've had enough sex for a sex talk for a weekend, but I want to thank you for your time. Once again, I just want to close on one note. I know that I've talked about things that touch on your lives, on my life too, and that sometimes people get very guilty about sexual stuff, and maybe guilty in an unhealthy way. There is nothing in the realm of sexual behavior that is any different from any other sin. God forgives us, God has grace for us, and God heals us. If I've said anything or touched on any issue that somehow has brought up a bad feeling or a bad memory, don't let it eat at you. Know that God's standards are not a problem, and that there's nothing that you've done and there's nothing that I've done that God can't forgive. And boy, oh boy, am I glad for that. Maybe you are too, eh? Let's bow our heads. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for all that you've given to us. We thank you for creating sex. We thank you for giving us the parameters in which sexual behavior should occur. We thank you for your warnings about things that would become problems and behaviors that would ultimately harm our children and ourselves. Lord, you know that we're very weak. You know that the standards of the world are all around us and that those standards influence us. Lord, please help us to bury our hearts in your word. Please help us to get a perspective on life, and that perspective that's informed by your standards and your advice and your laws, not by the chatter that is going on in a society that is increasingly walking away from your love. Lord, also please help us not to get a self-righteous attitude or a judgmental attitude. We all know that we've sinned. We all know that we're weak. We all know if we look into our hearts that we have problems of our own. We're not asking for you to condemn others. We're asking for you to save us. Lord, we love you, and we're so utterly grateful that despite the inadequacies in our lives and the problems that we have, that you love us. Please fill us with your grace, cover us, and may we grow in grace to be more and more like you, I pray. Amen.